crack straight on. My name is Stefan Scrimshire. I work in the Religions and Theology Department at the University of Manchester. Professor Dave Webb is speaking in this session. He's got a list of things that he does and has done that's far too long for the time we've got. The highlights for me are that he is the co-founder of the Praxis Centre, the study of information and technology in peace, conflict resolution and human rights at Leeds Metropolitan University. Sounds fascinating. He's a professor of engineering modelling and is also clearly committed to peace as the chair of Yorkshire CND, the convener of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, and is a member of the Scientists for Global Responsibility. So I'll hand over to Dave. We'll take some questions or points at the end, which may be related to this talk, but will also expand to the reflections on the whole day. So, Dave.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, I think this is a subject I'm not an expert in, really. I think it's something that cropped up in the one of the e-lists, that discussions that were going around, and Mark, thanks Mark, suggested that it might be an interesting idea to introduce this subject to this particular workshop. So these ideas that I'm just going to whiz through really are not mine. Some of them I think sound interesting. There's some interesting points to be made here, I think, but I think it would be really useful for you to say what you feel rather than me. So I think what I try and do is give a brief introduction. I don't know how many people know about various proposals for engineering the Earth in order to deal with climate change. I think that's what the purpose of some of these ideas is. So to look at some of those proposals, to look at the possibility of where international law might come into it, and then some of the questions that are posed, I think, by the proposals that have been made, the ideas put forward. The idea behind geoengineering, I think, is because the focus of policymakers has been on various forms of preventative regulation, and obviously it's too late. We haven't prevented climate change. We have to do something about what the effects of climate change might be, perhaps as well as trying to prevent further problems with CO2 production. So the difficulty there has been that climate change regulation requires huge amounts of will and coordination on a global scale, and again that hasn't happened. Kyoto-style programs are threatened by uncertainty, by cost, by problems of equity, and so on and so on. And even the most austere post-Kyoto regulatory regime can't now prevent global temperature rise. So then what do we do about that? How do we adapt, or do we adapt to climate change, or do we look for some other kind of alternatives? And these are some of the ideas that some of the engineers and scientists perhaps have come up with. The problem with preventing climate change through regulation then is it is a tragedy of the commons. It's a problem there people may be looking after themselves rather than after the global community. Effective climate change regulation has proven to be difficult to agree on an international scale. It's difficult to monitor, difficult to enforce. It requires more will than we currently appear to have. It means changing embedded structures, and that's an extremely difficult thing to do. And it means, therefore, that we haven't really got very far with that particular methodology or that particular route. Also, adapting to climate change, if we're just going to say, okay, we accept climate change, let's adapt to it, as we've heard, that may not even be possible and may even be completely disastrous. So, and it's not tackling the real problem of how we live on the planet together. So some of the possible, not particular solutions, but an idea to give us some time in which to address the problem more fundamentally has been to look at ways in which we can use engineering to give us a bit of time, to buy time really. And some of the suggestions that have been made have suggested, or some of the people making the suggestions have suggested that maybe geoengineering, manipulating the planet, might be a fairer way of doing it. It might be administratively simpler. It may be less contentious, and it may minimise the institutional role. I think you could query all of those points, but those are the points that have been made in order to suggest that this might be a route that we could take. It also avoids the tragedy of the commons, and what it's been likened to is a climate change form of a Manhattan Project, which I think is interesting. I mean, being involved in the campaign for nuclear disarmament, I understand what the Manhattan Project ended up with, and I'm sure that you all do too. I think it's termed that because it's meant to mean it's a really large program which requires all sorts of collaboration between different kinds of engineers, different sorts of scientists, perhaps even on an international scale, and it will involve a lot of investment, a lot of money, and in the end you come up with something really big. The question is there something you come up with that's really big, something you actually want, and something that you actually thought out carefully about how you might handle it. The problem also, of course, is if it's successful, if we can alleviate some of the problems that climate change brings about, it may actually accelerate energy use and production rather than help us to focus on how we might do the opposite. So there are a few proposals. These are the ones that I know about, and there may be others, but I think these are the ones that are generally discussed, and maybe we can just quickly go through those if you're not familiar with them. Iron fertilisation, sunscreen proposal, reflecting sunlight, doing it with huge mirrors, filtering carbon dioxide, storing it, or turning it into stone. Those are some of the ones. There are others like widespread tree planting, which I'm not going to count as a geoengineering project in the same way as the ones that we're talking about here. Iron fertilisation, rather, was probably posed around about the end of the 1980s, and what it involves is dumping tons of iron into the ocean to stimulate, I don't know why it says on the part there, but anyway, that was the idea in the 1980s. Now it's just dumping it in any ocean to stimulate phytoplankton growth, and the phytoplankton will absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then sink to the bottom of the ocean. That's the idea. So that iron is deposited on the bottom. Carbon dioxide is deposited on the bottom of the ocean. There's been a number of experiments to test whether this would actually work or not. A small patch of the Pacific was used and demonstrated that iron fertilisation could stimulate the productivity of ocean plants. There are estimates that suggest that just 1 pound of iron could produce enough plankton to sequester 100,000 pounds worth of carbon dioxide, even if only 1% efficient. Half a tonne of carbon could be sequestered for maybe a cost of only 10 cents. These are only estimates, and these are the estimates of the people who are proposing the idea.